And hi, everybody. My name's Myra Blythe. I'm a trustee, member of the Mint House, who have the pleasure and the privilege of hosting these network events on an almost monthly basis at the moment. Let me just give a few comments before we move into today's session. In case you are not familiar with the work of the Mint House, you may want to take note that we will be running a network event on October the 13th. You'll find information about that in the chat box or on the website, when the theme on that day will be what contribution can restorative practices make to the climate crisis. So a rather different theme to today's, but certainly one that is topical, and you may want to join us then. On a more practical level, you'll be aware that we're not able, due to GDPR regulations, to keep people's email addresses. So if you want to be in regular contact with us and to continue to be engaged with our activities, email joy@minthouseoxford.co.uk. And Joy will keep you absolutely up to date for everything that's going on, both between network events and a thriving website. It's growing all the time, to which you can also contribute. All of our network events are free, but nothing in life is actually free. So if you feel that you've been well served, then maybe you could do us the favor of offering a small contribution. Donations are possible, again, if you go to the Mint House website. It's lovely to hear from you, not just to have your donations, but also to have your critical feedback. And for that purpose, you will be able to click in the chat box onto our evaluation feedback. It's very fast, it won't take much time, but it allows you to influence the way we design events in the future. So please access the evaluation feedback. Joy will also send you a copy after the meeting in case you haven't had a chance to do that online during the meeting. So enough of those notices. Let's get to the business of today. It is a pleasure to be able to welcome Dave Aukett and two of his colleagues who will be sharing with us the experience of introducing restorative approaches into the prison community. Dave Aukett has been working with Sodexo Justice for 5 years and has been introducing restorative practice into 5 prisons. He is helped in his presentation today by 2 colleagues, Lynsey Pooley, who's the Restorative Prison Coordinator at Her Majesty's Prison in Peterborough, and by Jim Simon, the Chief Executive at the Restorative Justice Council, who may indeed have things to say a little bit about the fact that Sodexo has been recognised this year by the RJ Council for its status as a restorative organisation. So congratulations on that, Dave. It's good to see your work being recognised by the Council. We look forward to hearing what you have to say today. We will hopefully learn all that has been promised on the poster, which was that a discussion of restorative approaches to resolving conflict between prisoners and between prisoners and staff, how partnership is developing effectively between prison organisations and restorative justice service providers, and indeed how resolving family issues and conflicts through restorative family meetings is developing. So there's a whole range of issues that we can expect to cover in the next hour. And therefore, I want to hand over immediately to Dave and his colleagues for your presentation. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Myra. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm just getting up the presentation that we'll use today. As I say, thank you to the Mint House for inviting us to talk about the work we've been doing in the restorative prison, as we call it. As I say, as Myra says, Lynsey's joining us from Peterborough, not from the heart of HMP Peterborough, but from home, as she's currently on sick leave. So I'm glad that she's able to join us today, and I'll ask her to talk more about her role as we go through our presentation. presentation. It's great to have Jim on board as well, not only as Chief Executive of the RJC, but also Jim's been on this journey with us at Peterborough since 2018, when we applied for and received the Restorative Service Quality Mark, and he's seen the progression that's been made, and he'll talk hopefully objectively about that towards the end of the presentation. Maybe just before we start, just a bit of background information. Those of you that are unaware, Sodexo Justice operate 5 prisons in England and Scotland, both male and female. And actually HMP Peterborough is the only prison in England which has a male and female prison on the same site. Peterborough is a purpose-built prison built in 2005. It holds a capacity of 868 men and 376 women. That's not entrenched in my memory, that's just written down in front of me, thankfully. The other thing I want to say right at the beginning is, throughout the presentation, we will use the term residents to describe those in our care at Sodexo Prisons. And we appreciate that outside the prisons, this is not always seen as an appropriate term, and prisoner is often preferred. However, in terms of the role they play in the restorative prison and the rehabilitative nature of our work, we prefer and we will use the term resident throughout. So moving on, and a good place to start, always a good place to start, is what does this mean? What is a restorative prison? And this is the aim that we've been working to, and Myra gave us those 3 areas of restorative work in red, blue and green there. But having listened to the Bishop of Gloucester speak in the House of Lords last week on the debate on the Police, Crime and Sentencing and Courts Bill, I think we need to refine it, because she stood up in the House of Lords last week and advocated a criminal justice system which is restorative, responsible and relational, and which is focusing holistically on prevention and rehabilitation, as well as appropriate conviction and punishment. Well, those 3 words really rang out for me: restorative, responsible and relational. And that's effectively what we're trying to do in our prisons, focusing on prevention and rehabilitation. But in our case, it will be the appropriate use of the discipline processes which already exist within the prison. So I'm going to talk about each of these areas, but the heartbeat of the restorative prison is really that bit in red. It's the resolving conflict between residents and between residents and staff. We'll refer quite a lot to the fact that it has been a journey. This is not a quick fix, bolt on, get going very, very quickly and reap the rewards. You can do that. There can be some results, but we wanted to embed it into the culture of the prison, a whole prison approach. And Peterborough was very fortunate to join a pilot program in 2016 that was being run by Restorative Solutions in 3 prisons in England. And we were very fortunate as part of that. Peter Wolf, as some of you will know, was doing some work in Peterborough, and he suggested Peterborough would be a good prison to extend the pilot. And from then we've really developed some momentum from 2016 through the Restorative Service Quality Mark, and as Myra said, to the Restorative Organisation. And I'll dive a little bit into some of those milestones, but starting with this one, is probably a good place to start. It's nothing like a good evaluation to start a presentation. And after the pilot that we did for that 1 year, ICPR and the University of London did a short process-driven evaluation of the work we've been doing. And one thing that came through was about the importance of leadership and accountability, and we'll come back to that a number of times. The other thing that where we were in 2018 and that came through the evaluation and the RSQM is the key role that our residents have played in the success of this. It was really, really important to the success. When we first started on the Restorative Prisons pilot, it was a bit of an afterthought. Could we consider the use of residents? And now I'm now working in my 7th prison where I've introduced restorative approaches, and it's the starting point. It's how do we mobilise residents as participants, but also buying into this as a process that they can understand and they can work with. And just jumping on to the next milestone, as we said earlier, we've got the recognition earlier in the year, but it was nice to see in Damien, who's the director at Peterborough, his quote there, referring to the importance of that powerful tool in the rehabilitative journey. And again, more quotes from some of the residents, and you know, unlike you, I can put faces to those names, and those people have been on a personal journey themselves in discovering something about themselves, learning new skills, becoming really proficient facilitators, and the most important thing is being able to make a contribution and make a difference within the prison. I think there's also a reminder there in the bottom left quote from Chris, who's the head of rehabilitation at Peterborough, is that prisons are difficult places. As I say, I don't come from a prisons background, and they are tough environments, and they continue to be, and particularly over the last 18 months, prisons have become very, very difficult places to manage, and also from a resident point of view to, you know, to survive, if that's the right word. So it's useful to put that quote in there, is that's not just a quote that he provided today for this event. This is a message that he sent out to staff and residents to say, as we come out of lockdown, as there's more freedoms within the prison, there is likely to be an increase in tensions and violence, and therefore we need to respond accordingly with the use of restorative approaches where we can. Now, to introduce a definition like this is not a surprise to many of you, but I want to look at it from the point of view of a prison. Bringing people who have been in conflict together, as it says there, into communication in a prison is so countercultural to the tradition of prison in the UK. Establishments are built around safety, security, and risk minimization. Following a violent conflict, participants are immediately kept apart, often placed in segregation or dispatched to different parts of the prison, and often they'll have what they call keep separate markers put on them so they don't come into contact with the people they are in conflict with. There are systems and processes to ensure that people do not come into communication. It's also the case that anger and resentment from both parties following an incident is often transferred onto staff or the establishment as a whole for the way the conflict was managed through the discipline process or otherwise. So what I'm really trying to say there is that the systems and processes within a prison run contrary to the definition there in front of you. And from a resident's point of view, they have their own way of dealing with conflict. And this was, I was told this at Buckley Hall in Rochdale when I first started on this work, when the main man, as he was called in the prison, asked to see me to talk about conflict resolution. And he said, you might have the keys, but we have our own way of sorting out conflict in this prison, but we don't get the recognition from staff for doing it. And we had a very interesting conversation about his way of resolving conflict, which was actually the use of more violence. So it's interesting from a prison point of view that we've got the perspective from the prisons, we've got the perspective from staff about the way they handle conflict, but there is another way which we've explored, and that exploration is really around, again, some quotes that some of you may be familiar with. There's one there, the one there from Braithwaite is one that goes back a lot into my past of working with young offenders, but it's very true about the anger and the resentment in residents from maybe some of the way that they are punished, rather than getting them to reflect on the incidents they've been involved in. The other thing is that we want to try and use a restorative approach, or we have been using restorative approaches at earlier points in the conflict, not just reacting after they've occurred, but to intervene at a much earlier point to try and resolve some of the issues before they escalate. I mean, one of the pushbacks that we got from staff initially was, we haven't got time for this. We're busy. We've got so much to do, and I'm not doubting that whatsoever. Life as a wing officer is very, very busy indeed. But I remember talking to a group of staff, a staff team at Peterborough in the early days. And that's the pushback I got. I said that we haven't got time to do RA. Yeah, makes a lot of sense, but we just simply haven't got time for it. At which point their senior officer intervened, and he said, this morning, 4 of you have come to me with a request to move 4 people off the wing for issues that they've got with other people on the wing. Do you have any idea how much time it's going to take to find them suitable places to go, to move them, to get them settled in? So he said, you cannot talk to me about them not having enough time. So what we're saying here is, actually, if we build that emphasis of building the community on the wing and resolving issues on the wing, there's less need for us to continually move people around the prison. Which then leads us into what we're trying to achieve in terms of developing a sense of responsibility, reflection, respect, but also that, as I said before, that reintegration back into prison life before it gets to a point where we actually find it really very difficult to reintegrate, identify and act early. A really good example is someone who became quite prominent at Peterborough in one way to start with, because he was involved in an incident on a wing. There was a disagreement in the servery about the way that food was served. An argument took place, and it resulted in this one guy cracking the other one over the head with a metal ladle, which is quite a serious incident. And cut a long story short, they were both separated. They were both offered restorative approaches. One of the party who used the ladle agreed to it. They sat down, they worked it through, they discussed the issue. But afterwards, the issue was resolved satisfactorily to both of them. They're both kept on the wing. But then the guy who used the ladle said afterwards, actually, can I become a facilitator? And so eventually we got him on a training course, we trained him, and he became a prominent resident facilitator in the male prison. And so much as to say, when he, a couple of years later, left the prison, the director invited his family in, and they had a meal at lunchtime, and the director spoke about the contribution that he'd made to the prison in the time. So that's a really great example of that, his rehabilitative journey, but it's also giving him the opportunity initially to resolve the issue and move forward. The other thing is, and I'm drifting, there's a danger of me drifting, as the criminal justice system often leads us to, is thinking primarily around the offender, the perpetrator. And prisons are exactly the same as the criminal justice system, is that the dominant processes are around the offender. And I think just to quote what the Victims Commissioner Vera Baird has said, she described victims as observers and not participants in the criminal justice system. And it's the same in the prison. But what's different in a prison, and these are things which routinely come to us from residents, is those things about no support networks, the importance of not being seen as weak, nowhere to hide, and the issue seems far worse locked behind the door, and the potential of facing the harmer again or someone acting on their behalf. Now, we may all have a perception of what a vulnerable prisoner looks like in a prison. That's not the case. Prisoners come in victims come in all shapes or sizes out in the community, equally so in a prison. Sometimes the people that you'd expect to be the most resilient can be the ones that feel most vulnerable as a result. And maybe just to give you an example from a victim's perspective, this is our prison up in Manchester Forest Bank, a case that I came across earlier in the year that one of the staff there was working with. And there was a dispute over a waste bin, a small thing. Quite often in the prison, the most serious acts of violence can start from very, very small, low-level incidents. So there's a dispute over a waste bin. And a fight between two residents, and they were both put behind their doors. The resident facilitator took the lead, and he spoke to both parties. They both agreed to meet and discuss it. The meeting took place. There was an agreed outcome. They both shook hands, and they both agreed to put it behind them. But interestingly, the victim later that day handed the RA facilitator an adapted blade, and effectively a knife he'd made in the event of the conflict continuing. So he was satisfied after that restorative meeting that actually he was safe and secure and he didn't need it. So, we're talking about quite high stakes here being a victim. And it's really quite sobering when we sit and we talk to residents in training and in other environments about what it's like in a prison to have these feelings of vulnerability. A project isn't a project within a prison without a process. And I just want to put up in front of you two different ways we look at using restorative approaches. Firstly, what we would say is a proactive way. Again, residents will say to us that they know, usually 2 days before staff do, where conflict is likely to occur. So we're empowering and enabling them to be able to intervene, which is safe for them, safe for others, to offer an opportunity to resolve the issue. Now that can come through staff referrals, resident referrals, a variety of different ways. And then that resident can lead that restorative process working with staff. We also can be reactive. Prisons are structured and being quite often reactive to incidents, and you see there, I won't go through it in great detail, but you can see the referrals that come into Lynsey, for example, at Peterborough, from a variety of different sources, and a decision then is made whether it's an informal or formal restorative approach that's used. Usually that's based around whether it can be dealt with and whether there is a facilitator that's suitable on that wing to take on the case. And just to give you an example of the types of situations where we would consider using restorative approaches. As you can see there, a whole range of different instances, and they vary considerably. One that might jump out for you is gang issues. Clearly we can't, within the confines of the prison, resolve the gang issues, the external gang issues. But what we have done is got gang members together sometimes when there's fear of incidents occurring in the prison to talk through how they actually will react, how they will work, how they will observe each other and respect each other whilst in the prison. And it's just a way of preventing any escalation and also smoothing over any misunderstandings there may be. Just to sum up then, I've mentioned so many times now the important role of residents, and we've really been on a journey with selecting, working with residents. Is they walk a very difficult line. We don't usually have the usual suspects because that staff normally go to for everything, because the reality is they're often not approachable by their peers. And so we work with staff, we work with residents to ensure that the residents are based on the wing that they can speak to and work with. They receive the 3-day RA foundation training, and we like to, where possible, where we can get staff released from duties, is train staff and residents together because we're training them in the same skill. Just the last point there is around confidentiality. As trust and confidence builds in the individual residents, we can quality assure their processes without always having to know exactly what takes place within a meeting. And that trust is an important part of the development process of the project. Just want to give you a little bit of a snapshot of August last year. As we were coming out of lockdown version 1 at Peterborough, the director said, I want restorative approaches built into our recovery plan. And therefore we trained a resident on every single wing on the male prison in July last year, and then looked at the figures afterwards. And just take you through a couple of them. I think first thing to say is we sometimes talk about in restorative practice a conversion rate between the number of offers that are made and the number of people take it up. Well, it's a very good conversion rate of 20 meetings out of 37 offers. But that's not 17 failures. That's 37 conversations that are taking place with vulnerable residents that don't necessarily end up in a restorative intervention. And then if you go down to the bar chart on the right hand side, you'll see 15, I think it is there, that of those cases have been identified by residents on the wing. And the interesting part for me was when we then started looking at the types of incident. Now, if it was a reactive process and we were just drawing information from daily intelligence bulletins, etc., I would say that pie chart would be predominantly assaults and fights. The fact that the residents are identifying issues earlier in the conflict, or identifying the situations where RA could be used, therefore we're getting arguments, disagreements, and bullying as quite dominant there. So for us, that was quite a significant indicator that the work that the residents were doing. Lynsey, I'm very conscious of time and Jim is speaking as well, but just from your point of view, can I just ask you to start with, there's no such thing as a typical week, but what does a Monday look like as a restorative prison coordinator?
So normally after I've grabbed my morning coffee to get me ready, every prison will have, we refer to it as a daily briefing sheet. So that just literally details all activity that's happened within the prison within the last 24 hours. So normally on a Monday with my coffee, I will sit down and look at the daily briefing sheet from what's happened on the Friday, the Saturday and the Sunday. From that, it's planning the workload. Restorative approaches, practices very much built in with our violence reduction strategy and the way that we deal with those incidents once they occur. We will do a restorative post-incident needs assessment, first with the victim and then with the perpetrator. Sometimes that will be in person, sometimes over the cell phone. I then will allocate those cases out and review open cases just to plan the week. That's normally the Monday, just seeing what's happened over the weekend and what we need to do that day.
Good. Okay, so that's Monday. What do you do for the rest of the week? Well, I mean, just give us a flavour of some of the other things that you're involved in through the week.
Yeah, so we will catch up with our resident RA champions, which is a paid role, and then also the voluntary role of the resident wing reps, which was on every of our wing. I will do and see what they're up to, see what the mood is like on the wing, etc. Restorative families, I will have referrals that come in and I'll do the screening and assessment. We could, catch up with the reps. Preparing training for staff and residents, with the restorative justice cases that we constantly have ongoing. I will speak to the restorative justice providers that we work in partnership with those cases. Pathfinder meetings we will attend, and that's for our restricted status female residents. I will attend the complex needs assessment meeting. Fridays are very important for me. Like most prisons, they will have a safety intervention meeting every Friday, and that's to review the cases, but also then to discuss anything that in regards to the safety of the residents and the prison and the staff. So very much restorative approaches as part of that. What have we done? Has there been someone that's been a perpetrator of an incident? Actually, they're not showing remorse, but we know what, from having a restorative conversation with them, we know what their triggers are, etc., and potentially what do we need to do as a prison to work with them. Also with the victims as well, maybe they need some additional support again, because if we can support them, that then reduces self-harm or potentially more violence. Team meetings with residents and the staff. I could go on.
I think, Lynsey, I mean, if anyone's got specific questions about the parts of Lynsey's role, we'll come to that in the questions. I'm very conscious of time now and the need to push through the presentation, and I think I've picked up some of these points already. You know, Lynsey and I have talked about some of these challenges and getting it owned in residential areas, and RA not being a bolt-on. Lynsey's part of the rehabilitation team, but it's not something that happens in a different part of the prison. It's something that happens and is owned on the residential units. We've now got staff on each house block who are what we call RA res leads. They are the points of contact for us, and they are points of contact for the trained residents as well. So we're very much focused on the importance of getting it embedded into residential practice. And so much to say that for the last 5 years, we've been doing an introduction to RA one-day training session for every initial officer course at the prison. So it's not just about training. I'll talk about communication in a short time. But we do have the problem of turnover of residents. Some are placed on hold with their agreement, of course, and stay in the prison. But we do have a rolling program of training. And it's also this part of the restorative prison not being fully understood or included in the inspection regime. It doesn't necessarily conveniently fit any one segment that they're inspecting as a whole prison approach, and therefore when inspection time does come at the prison, RA sometimes pushed onto the back burner because of other things of taking higher priority. I've talked about the focus on the offender, not necessarily the victim, but as Lynsey says there are lots of things that we're doing now to try and to balance that out. And clearly over the last 18 months we've been challenged with the time that residents have out of their cell. Just a couple of things before I pass over to Jim. All we would say about the restorative justice work, that's the work that we do external with RJ service providers, is that we see this very much as a working partnership, that we establish good partnerships based on memorandum of understanding, data sharing agreements, and we work jointly. And Kate from Restorative Solutions gave us this quote recently to go into one of our newsletters, and you'll see that Emma and Lily are the RJ leads at HMP Bronzefield, which is a women's prison just outside London. Interestingly, that Emma and Lily are, what they've done at Bronzefield is sort of separate the restorative approaches is owned in safer custody, where Emma is a manager in the offender management unit, and so RJ and RA, as we call it, have been separated in that prison. In terms of restorative families, that this is something that evolved from the restorative approaches. A senior officer said, "Could we try this with families?" And I had a bit of background with family group conferencing, so we had a look at the models there from the family rights group, and we thought, how could that be adapted to work with residents as a way of supporting residents and their families to restore their communication and relationships that have broken down. And we've had some really interesting cases around co-parenting. We had a 14-year-old girl working with her social worker that wanted to reach out and ask questions of her mother who was in custody. We've had cases where families come in and met with their son to understand more about his drug use. We've had meetings to talking about what happens after prison and resettlement. So it's all about trying to restore some of those family relationships. it's not necessarily about pre-release. It is that, but it's also about restoring those family relationships while that person continues in custody. And finally, for me, it's communication. It's we have a communications manager who we have a communications plan with, posters, leaflets. The director is very supportive. He puts it into his weekly brief on a regular basis, and we continually working with staff and residents to encourage the use of not just restorative approaches, but restorative justice and restorative families. Having run over significantly, it's probably a good time to hand over to Jim, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dave. Well, I've had the pleasure of working with Peterborough Prison over the past 4 years, and that's given me a real unique opportunity to see their work evolve. So they were first awarded the Restorative Service Quality Mark back in 2018, and more recently awarded our registered Restorative Organisation status. Through this registration process, we've independently assessed their restorative work with a specific focus on leaderships, policies and procedures, training, support and supervision, and practice delivery. And for us, these are the 5 building blocks for developing a restorative organisation and restorative culture. Now, we know for a restorative community to develop and thrive, then there has to be leadership from the top, and senior leaders must have a clear vision about what it is their community will look like and how they're going to build capacity to deliver this vision. And with that in mind, capacity building priorities should be included within strategic and operational plans, and there's got to be robust processes in place to evaluate both progress and impact. But having a clear vision and specific targets is, of course, important. Leaders also need to ensure that staff are empowered to operationalise these, and that starts with ensuring that their policies and procedures enable staff to facilitate safe and effective restorative processes. Now, typically in organisations, existing policies and procedures do not reflect the requirements for this, and in fact it's not uncommon that existing policies and procedures actually contradict the core principles of restorative practice. Understanding how restorative practices fit within the prison's existing procedures is crucial, and Dave sort of touched on this and said we know from experience that bolt-on restorative practices are unlikely to be sustainable or have the desired impact. So making time to review and update policies and procedures to incorporate requirements for safe and effective practice increases the potential for success. And Peterborough Prison, alongside many other organisations, use our practice guidance and the National Occupational Standards as a tool for guiding that piece of work. We also know that providing appropriate training and ongoing professional development is crucial, but it doesn't mean that all staff need to be trained as practitioners. Training that's provided should be commensurate with the individual's role and should consider how they're likely to use training within their day-to-day operations. So within a prison, you may have some staff or residents in Peterborough's instance who are facilitating direct restorative processes either internally or working with external partners. And for these individuals, practitioner training is important. But you might also have wing staff who are using restorative language, informal restorative questioning or facilitating restorative circles on the wing. And for those, a more sort of introductory type training would be more appropriate. This training that you provide to your staff and your practitioners provides them with the knowledge and the initial skills to start practicing, but ongoing support and supervision helps them to grow and develop as practitioners. And again, practice supervision comes in many forms, and like training, should be commensurate with the individual's role. So for those practitioners working directly, facilitating direct restorative processes, then one-to-one case supervision is appropriate, and our guidance suggests that that should be at least quarterly, if not more often. But those working more informally also need an opportunity for supervision, but this is likely to be less frequent and potentially can be incorporated into existing meeting schedules. The most important consideration when planning sort of case supervision is that it's led by a suitably experienced practitioner And this can be problematic at the beginning of any restorative journey. So it's not uncommon to see organisations engaging with external consultants and supervisors in the first instance. So having clear policies and procedures, appropriate training, support and supervision provides staff with the tools they require to facilitate safe and effective restorative processes. However, how they use that in practice is going to vary, of course, depending on the setting. But the core principles of safe and effective practice always remain consistent. So when we're assessing an organisation for registered status, we focus on how practitioners are identifying an appropriate restorative response. What sort of risk assessments are they undertaking to ensure that the process is safe? How are they preparing themselves and the participants? How are they facilitating that process? And how are they monitoring the outcomes that are agreed as part of that? Now, that's a very, very brief overview of our registration standards and how they're applied in a prison setting. An important takeaway, and Dave has said this already, is that becoming a restorative prison, a restorative organisation, is not a quick process. There's no shortcut to creating and embedding a restorative culture, and it's very much a journey that will evolve over time. And HMP Peterborough provide an excellent example of that restorative journey. Being able to assess them on 2 occasions has provided me with an opportunity to observe how far they've travelled over that 3-year period. And what I'd like to do is just briefly share some of the noticeable differences between 2018 and 2021. So when I first visited the prison back in 2018, prison leaders clearly demonstrated a commitment to restorative practices. They'd identified where and how restorative practices would be most beneficial, and they'd committed funding to build a team of practitioners to lead the prison's restorative work. They'd identified resident practitioners and trained them, and they were actively practicing on the wings under the supervision of staff practitioners. Although prison leaders at that time had a desire to embed restorative practices across the community prison, they decided that they would take a targeted approach, so targeted resources to build practitioner experience and confidence before embarking on a wider rollout. In 2021, there'd been a significant shift. So that commitment had become more embedded, and there was a strong restorative culture that was developing across the prison. Restorative practices have been integrated into many more aspects of prison life, including early intervention on the wings, adjudication processes, and in supporting vulnerable residents. Ensuring that staff and residents understood the prison's restorative culture had been pivotal to ensuring its success. And leaders implemented a range of strategies to ensure that effective communication was being held across the prison. And this included regular updates from the prison director, effectively communicating significant changes to practice, policy and procedure to colleagues, and involving residents in these communications where it was appropriate to do so. But one particular strength that I saw is that leaders had an absolute astute awareness of the challenges which could destabilise this restorative culture, and most notably, changing population of residents and the potential for staff movement. What I was most impressed was with the support that they'd put in place to ensure that the restorative practice coordinator and her team had strategies to mitigate this risk. So they identified that any one person could destabilise this journey and had planned to mitigate that wherever possible. When we look at policies and procedures back in 2018, we identified that restorative practices were reflected in several key documents, but most policies and procedures for restorative practice were standalone. And although they were fit for purpose, it wasn't always clear how it linked to the wider prison work. And this was another significant area of development over the past 3 years. A full review of internal policies have been undertaken, and 52 internal documents have been reviewed and updated to ensure that they met the Restorative Council's practice guidance. And again, Dave just touched on this. In 2018, the prison were provided targeted training to specific staff and residents identified as being suitable to become practitioners. In 2021, there's now a requirement for all new staff joining the prison to undertake a one-day restorative approaches course as part of their training, ensuring that that culture is built in from day one. So when comparing the prison's restorative practice in 2018 to 2021, it quickly became apparent that there'd been a major shift in culture. Leaders had taken a systematic approach to realising their vision for a restorative prison and have worked with the community to build on their successes. And there's a great deal that can be learned from Peterborough's restorative journey, but simply lifting their model and trying to duplicate it in another setting is unlikely to be successful. So we know that there's a huge variation across the custodial estate, and that will determine the way in which restorative practices can be developed. Certainly, it's going to be harder in some prisons than others, and identifying the most appropriate delivery model has got to be the first priority. Now, typically, we see that there are two main ways of doing this. Where internal capacity is restrictive, we often see that prisons take steps to engage with external agencies to provide access to restorative processes. But external providers are unlikely to accept cases for internal conflict. But where there is capacity, a prison can take the initiative to actively try and ensure that they've got the systems, processes and structures in place to integrate restorative practices throughout the prison community. A senior level support to ensure that time and resources are dedicated to making restorative practices happen is of course crucial. And senior leaders have a critical role to play in sending a clear signal to all prison staff and the wider community that restorative practices is a priority. Having an engaged governor who makes their support for restorative practice clear is a powerful way of showing that it's at the core of the prison's work. But senior level support can't just be about signalling. The governor needs to make sure that they're supporting the staff to make restorative practices available. And this can include things like ensuring designated times to discuss restorative practice at team meetings, senior team meetings, that it becomes part of prison life. It's also important that there's an individual at a senior level within the prison who's got oversight of restorative practices. And we see this in Dave's role at Sodexo. And having someone accountable for delivering this vision. This could be a dedicated role, or it could be the head of reducing offending who has responsibility built into their job description. And most importantly, the delivery of restorative practice must be supported by a knowledgeable staff body who have undertaken an appropriate level of training. To support the wider rollout of restorative practices, having a staff base who know what restorative practice is and what it involves is essential. The more prison staff understand about restorative practice, the more likely they'll support its smooth running. Now, restorative practice in a prison environment not only needs a staff body that understands it, but one that's supportive of it. And awareness raising amongst staff is important, but also deeper engagement is necessary to ensure longevity and effectiveness. Prison officers need to be engaged with restorative practices. If staff on the wings are not genuinely interested or engaged, then they're less likely to make restorative ways of working happen. So communicating the benefits of restorative practices, which awareness raising will go some way towards, can be important in securing genuine engagement. But also seeing how well it works can help engage staff. So sharing good news stories, promoting case studies on the prison's intranet can also motivate staff. And we all know that good news stories can be few and far between in a prison. So positive stories about how well restorative practice is working helps convince those who are not supportive. And certainly we see this in Peterborough with regular communications about their successes. Now we know there's no single model that's going to work across the prison estate. It is an individual journey that's going to look different in every prison setting. But there are tools available to support you. So the RJC's registration framework can be used as a tool for self-assessment. Alongside this, our practice guidance, the National Occupation Standards provide detailed guidance for delivering safe and effective restorative processes, which can be translated into the prison environment. And also here in the UK, there's HMPPS's rehab team who are available to provide advice and guidance and support throughout a restorative journey. And of course, we need to learn from the successes of others, such as Peterborough Prison, who have done a remarkable job over the past 4 years to get to where they are. And I look forward to seeing them where they are in another 3 years' time. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to hand back to Dave, and thank you.
And I'm conscious of time as well, so I'll just leave this slide up if it's okay with you, which really pulls together some of the key points that we made during our presentation. Apologies that we've run over. So back to you, Myra.
Okay, thanks, Dave, and all the contributors for a rich presentation. We have not a lot of time, but what I've said in the chat is that we will try and run over a little bit so that some of the many questions that have actually been coming in on the chat can get picked up. In the early stages of questions, there were questions about confidentiality and independence. Anna Taylor asked about, is confidentiality organized like the listener scheme, or is there something very unique to the confidentiality protocol that you're operating with? And Gert Jan Slump, many questions come in, but his first one was around independence of the RJ facilitator. How much are they reporting, and what is the level of their independence?
Really good questions. I think I'll try and be brief. That if you understand confidentiality for listeners, that's exactly the principles that we work to. Is that obviously there are limits to that confidentiality when harm may be caused to the establishment or individuals involved, as you would expect. But sometimes the meetings that residents will facilitate, we might not need to know the ins and outs. If we had a resident facilitator who continually said, I'm not talking about any of my cases, they're 100% confidential, we would have concerns. They're the exception rather than the rule. Normally, everyone is aware of the conflict and they are discussed. The independence, one of the reasons why we haven't integrated it into the discipline process through adjudications, it is a separate process from the discipline process. So there is a degree of independence from that. Our concern was initially that residents would see it as being punished twice in many ways, to think, oh, I've got to go through their nicking, as they call it, and then do restorative approach. Well, the restorative approach is voluntary. It is independent of the discipline process, discipline process. And quite often we maybe overthought that, because residents often come back and they say, yeah, I know I've got to do the nicking, but I still need to sort the issue out with that person that I was involved with. So they can separate the two quite easily.
Okay, Gert, do you want to come back on that? If you're still there, Gert from the Netherlands?
Yeah, I'm still there. Am I visible?
Maybe we could remove the screen, the shared screen, so we can see more people. Yep. Yeah. Excellent, thank you.
Hi, I'm Gert-Jan Slump from Restorative Justice the Netherlands, and thank you for the excellent presentation of the three presenters, and thank you, Myra, for hosting this excellent workshop or webinar. I'm very curious, because a prison is an institution of power. So how I'm a little bit, how do you call it, curious about if the listeners' scheme will be sufficient to balance the power difference that are in a total institution like a prison. So is that enough, or is it not enough? So related to the independency question.
It is a very interesting one in terms of that balance of power and influence. And I don't think we certainly work on a wing by wing basis and establish the relationships between the residents that we've trained and the staff. So there's a clear lines, and certainly that is something that develops over time. And I certainly, in a prison that was starting out with this, the issue of confidentiality, I would say that emerges over time as trust is built up. But we absolutely, and I say this to staff, we cannot expect or utilize our trained residents as sources of information of intelligence about what's happening in the prison. We need to respect the confidentiality and their ability fundamentally to resolve the conflict. And we can quality assure their processes to make sure they follow the correct processes through the planning, preparation and delivering of the restorative intervention. But we might not necessarily need to understand the detail of what goes into that conversation.
Because I know from the practice in restorative justice and mediation in criminal justice cases in the Netherlands, even in a criminal justice procedures, confidentiality is very scrutinized, related to only having the outcomes, if parties want so, to be put into an agreement or a plan or whatever. So well, and it might be much more challenge in a closed system like a prison, I guess, because it's not a society like the Netherlands, 17 million people, or a criminal justice system with 100,000 cases. It's a community of 1,100 inhabitants or fellows or residents.
And that's, bringing it down to the local level of those units and making it relational on those units and building that trust and respect between. And that's the thing that I've seen more significantly than anything else at Peterborough, is that relational difference between staff, and it's different. It feels different than it was in 2016.
And I guess there might be a conflict or an incident that is exemplary for structural, how do you call it, defects in a system. So how do you deal with that? Because then the confidentiality is a question mark, or not?
So how do we deal with whether it's a question mark or not? I mean,
no. If you have a conflict that's seemingly pointing towards a structural, how do you call it, defect in an organization or in a program, then the confidentiality is a question mark, I guess.
Well, it is, but it would be down to the facilitator to work with the participants to ensure that they are happy if any confidences are broken for the purposes of changing anything on that wing, or indeed the establishment as a whole. And I mean, we didn't go into it in depth, we haven't got time for it now, but we also have restorative forums, which is more of the opportunity to meet with staff and talk about some of the issues and practical, maybe any deficiencies in the way that prison is responding.
Okay, maybe we can move on from confidentiality to some questions that have been coming in around impact, if you like. One question was around the role or the impact, different or similar in work with women and with male residents. Is there a gender difference in terms of how RA is being played out and being effective? And another question about impact was, have you noticed a substantial or serious or obvious difference in terms of the incidences of assault on staff?
Right. I mean, the first way to answer that the prison managers will say consistently our violence levels have been below our comparator prisons, even through the last 18 months. And I suppose that's the difficulty I have in responding to that, because the last 18 months have been unique in terms of the reductions of violence, because the residents have been behind their door for a considerable part of it. In terms of impact of male and female prison, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, Lynsey, around what the differences you see from working across both prisons. You're on mute, Lynsey.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, our take up is the restorative approaches, I think. So from an offer to where we've then held a restorative, it's been a restorative outcome. I don't think we've ever got below 30% on either side. We are always reflecting on what the male and the female say. So for instance, if violence is very low on the female side, but if there is a violence, normally it is between where a resident has caused harm to a member of staff. What the restorative approach has been able to do is actually the prisoner wanting to reduce the violence, because that's what we are contracted to do as a private prison, and that's what we want to do. So actually it gives a learning. So actually some of the women might say, so especially we're a trauma-informed prison on the female side. So a lot of our female residents have received trauma, and there may be triggers. For example, a male member of staff may have gone into a room and shouted at a female resident, and it's been a trigger for their trauma, and unfortunately not condoning it, but they have lashed out. So we have worked with and we have some very complex females that actually restorative approaches works with them, because we're staying impartial, we're not telling them. Very hard for prison staff. Trust me, I've worked in the prison service for over 10 years. It's very hard not to tell them what to do. But that is the magic of restorative approaches. We're asking them the questions, and we're learning. With the males, they like to nip it in the bud quickly. They don't want to be worried about bumping into matey, or actually they don't want to have a problem with that staff member, because actually they have to rely on the staff to open their door and actually let them live their lives in custody. So we do find that males, they want to resolve stuff within 24 hours of an incident or a conflict arising. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. Can you give us some examples of where policy in one of those 5 prisons, policy has not changed, and so the story is not all good?
Ooh. We talked about the journey. My journey from Gloucestershire to HMP Peterborough in Scotland is a significant one. And one of the issues that we're facing there is any incidents of violence have to be referred to Police Scotland. That's a policy decision from the Scottish Prison Service. Now, it's our policy within RA that if we're not going to get in the way of a police investigation, and sometimes those investigations, as those of you who are familiar with working in prisons, can take a significant period of time, which effectively is ruling out any opportunity for a restorative intervention because the investigation continues. So, yes, sometimes there are things that cannot be moved, that frustrate. That can frustrate. And also, I mean, we do have an adjudication process. That process has to be followed. There's an expectation that's followed. And we've tried over the years of different, using a restorative approach, should the adjudication process be adjourned to explore restorative approaches? We've come to the conclusion the best way is actually to let that adjudication process run its course, and then use restorative approaches to reintegrate that resident back onto the wing. It's almost like saying, can we put a restorative approach into a court process? Really challenging. So sometimes those very firmly embedded practices and processes and policies just don't change.
Okay. Another question that's been asked has, what's the content of these 3 days of training? I mean, 3 days is a long time, but not very long. How substantial would you rate that level of training?
It's a good question. Following RJC practice standards, that we say that is the minimum for a foundation trained practitioner. We do give work that is particularly with residents to do back in their cells. Time that we have with them is often limited within those 3 days as well. We do train them up to a point where they can co-facilitate, and that's quite an exciting to see, because that co-facilitation is not necessarily just with another resident, it can be with a member of staff as well. So we train them over those 3 days to include co-facilitation. But we also, part of that is also about how they deliver, the primary focus of it is how to deliver restorative practice informally. I mean, I'd say 9 out of 10 of the cases which come through all of our prisons, there are 2 participants. So we don't want to spend a huge amount of time training residents, particularly to facilitating large groups. So the focus is very much around small group dynamic.
So what is the meaning of community, a circle or community of support when it comes to RJ or RA in prisons? Because that's a key principle, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we take it down to the wing level, and we have the sort of officers, the senior officer, or what they call the wing IC, who's responsible for that wing, and that's the basis of our residential community. The prison is full up of a whole range of different communities in lots of different ways, whether they go to their places of work, education, healthcare, gym, a variety of different places. We don't ignore those places, but we acknowledge that actually in the residential areas, those communities there are the ones that are more likely to have issues of violence.
Okay.
What we've started to bring in, what Lynsey started to bring in at Peterborough now, is for the weekly meetings, is do a heat map around the prison, particularly residential areas, to see where we have used restorative approaches, where it's working, where we may have it's not working so well, where we need to put some effort.
Lynsey, what's the heat map showing at the moment?
Yeah, it was literally generated last week. So by all means, if those that want to contact me at Peterborough, you can do, and I can share that for you for the month of September.
That'd be great. That'd be great. You've talked about the outreach to families, which is kind of getting outside of the prison community itself. Have there been, and this relates to a question that was asked at a previous session, is there a practice in any of these 5 prisons that the prisoners, the residents themselves, can make an approach to their victims for RJ? Often it seems to be only one-way traffic.
Oh no, this is definitely two-way. This is offenders working through offender supervisors, through their key workers in the prison, whatever way. They may go through a restorative approach for a conflict they have in the prison and say, actually, I'd like to do this to the victim, with the victim. So what we then do is we then reach out to the RJ service provider where that incident's occurred, and then we start that relationship. So we have memorandums of understanding, data sharing agreements with the national providers. We also have agreements with the local providers as well. Two-way street, definitely.
That's good news. That's good news. I've been trying to cover some of the questions in the chat box. If anybody feels that their question hasn't been raised and they really would like an answer, would you like to just register? I see Gert has another question he wants to ask, but register if you'd like to raise your hand. Gert, go for it.
Yeah, thank you so very much. One question that puzzles me is, if I'm right, it was about 37 cases dealt with in a restorative way, with conflicts. So how many incidents were there in this period of measuring?
I haven't got that information, and that's one thing that one of our tasks is our monitoring system for restorative approaches. It still needs to be integrated into the incidents, the reported incidents, through either intelligence or from other sources. So
is there an estimate?
I mean, I don't know, Lynsey, would you be able to come up with an estimate of how many incidents of violence it varies so much, doesn't it?
So what, sorry, there's a question you want to know.
How does the 37 cases in a restorative way dealt with relate to the amount of incidents in this period? So what is the percentage of incidents that were successfully dealt with in a restorative way within the prison?
From the chart, so the chart that Dave showed with where we had, so when it said the daily briefing, that means that there'd been an actual violent incident that had been reported within the prison. And then there was a comparison that actually, aside from those, the residents had then gone on and done 15 cases.
I mean, the other thing to say, hopefully making it a little bit clearer, is that some of those incidents, if we want to call them an incident, may not have even come to the attention of the prison. They're conflicts that have been identified by residents. So you're not measuring like with like, if that makes sense. The 37 instances, some of which will have never come to our attention because maybe there were disagreements, arguments that were resolved by the residents before they escalated to a point where they were recorded.
But then the dark number is very interesting, not only for the percentage of officially recorded incidents and restorative incidents recorded officially, but the effect on the culture of the of the community. having prisoners and officers dealing, or prisoners between themselves dealing with conflicts themselves would be very interesting to have.
It is.
Numbers
I think
of,
that it's a really good question. It's an area of work where we're talking with the University of Gloucestershire about we really need to do some more evaluation work, some more academic work about this. The piece that we did back in 2016 to 18 was very limited, and we need to start digging a little bit deeper. But prisons aren't particularly good at doing that sort of detailed research. We just like to get on and do it. But yeah, it's a really good point.
That will make it quite difficult next year. I think you said there's going to be a kind of review of the work that you've done in the 5 prisons. So that that evaluation will be hampered a little bit with that lack of statistical evidence.
Well, yes and no. Is that already, even not just Peterborough, but the other prisons, the directors and the senior management are starting to see the impact and the value of it in a variety of different ways across the prison. So they will individually continue their support. I suppose what I'm saying is, hopefully by the end of next year, my task individually is to make them self-sustainable, is so they can deliver their own training, they can support themselves, they have all the systems and processes in place to allow me to step away.
Okay. I wonder if Clifford is here from the Home Office prison servicing. Clifford, can you see a future for this expanding to other prisons if you're there? He's disappeared.
I am here. Let me just try and get. No, I think we're very interested, obviously, as well as some of the contracted prisons. There are many of the public sector prisons which have explored the use of restorative approaches. And obviously, we're very keen to sort of discuss this and to learn from everyone's experience and to see how it can play its part, because our overarching, obviously, intention is that the prisons become safer places, and we're also very interested in how the experience of restorative approaches can help with rehabilitation, with people learning these life skills as to how to resolve conflict. So no, we're very, very interested, and I'm very keen to know that there'll be some further evaluation, because obviously that would be very helpful. If we get something independent and external, that would be great.
And Jim, when you did your recognition of the restorative organisation, where would you say restorative organisations need to work most in order to strengthen their practice?
I think one of the things that organisations and prisons in particular find the biggest challenge is when we start looking at effectiveness and impact. I think the one thing that we're very good at measuring is efficiency, so we can say how many things we've done. We are not so good at saying how effective or what impact that has necessarily had, and certainly that's an area that the RJC are also interested in, and we've just commissioned a three-year study to look at that, to help develop our practice and ultimately others working across the restorative sector. And I think it's also it's being clear about when restorative approaches are and aren't suitable. So I know Gert was asking lots of questions around numbers and how many cases were reported, and I think it's also having that understanding of when it isn't appropriate to consider a restorative process or a restorative response. And that's the same outside of a prison setting. There will be a number of referrals that are made where it just simply isn't appropriate or safe to progress that through. So again, within the numbers that we're presenting, we also need to be able to identify those where it just wasn't appropriate to do so, which would be an appropriate outcome. And the other area, particularly relating to Peterborough, so the discussions we were having around confidentiality and the role of the resident practitioners and how we keep those impartial. And it didn't really come out from Dave and Lynsey, but the staff team that are there have an oversight of everything that goes on. So when a referral comes in, they are able to determine whether or not a staff practitioner or a resident practitioner needs to pick that up. So it isn't a free-for-all, we can go off and do a restorative process, and we may or may not report it to Dave and Lynsey. There's a really clear process there to manage that and to manage any conflicts. So again, I think within, when we're talking about policies and procedures, it's a real strength how Peterborough use residents. But the processes to make sure that that's safe and effective are there. And it is very well controlled. And again, when I spoke to resident practitioners across the prison, they really understand the different roles they play. They understand when they go to work and are a restorative practitioner, and when they are somebody who is on the wing. And that's a real strength as well. And I think it's a real strength that staff have developed relationships with those residents that are professional, and they can sort of be distinct between those two roles. So there's a lot of work that goes in that's really hard in this sort of setting or in a short time to sort of to get across. But I think the main areas are being clear around policies and procedures. We do need to get better at evaluation and data. That isn't just in prisons, that's across the board.
Yeah. Myra, do you mind if I just make a comment on a question I've seen in the chat today about staff conflict? The answer to that is yes. We have to practice what we preach. The staff use of restorative approaches for staff is written into our HR policy and practice. Just very quickly, we always say you need to be one position senior to be able to facilitate a meeting between two staff members in conflict. I facilitated meetings between managers. Lynsey's facilitated them between staff. It's an informal resolution to the grievance process, and our HR business partner, she was trained back in 2016, I think, as a facilitator, and is fully behind this.
That's great. That's great. I'm looking for any remaining hand signal to say there's a question not answered. I think we can take one more if there is, but otherwise, I think it's my role to on your behalf, thank our presenters who have given a lot of information and a lot of hope. But we wait to see whether this will expand as evaluations are made and into other prisons. Can I thank you again, Dave and Lynsey, and our RJ representative as well. It's been great to hear from you all. Anybody got a last question, or any of the presenters a last comment that you want to make? If not, I remind you again that we have another session on October the 13th, where we're looking at the contribution of restorative practice to the climate crisis. I hope we'll see some of you there then. Thanks again, and cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.